What's up, Kings fans, and welcome to the Hockey Royalty Podcast, the official podcast of HockeyRoyalty.com. I'm Scott Kinville, and before we get going, I want to let you know that you can find us on social media. You can find us on Facebook at the Hockey Royalty Podcast, and you can also find us at Hockey_Royalty and at Royalty_Pod, and those are both on Twitter. I kind of screwed that up. Sorry about that. But anyways, we got a great show lined up for you. And before we bring our guest in, I'm going to bring in my co-host. So I'm going to let you know that Russ is not here just yet. He'll be here in the second part, but he's not here right now. But as always, riding shotgun with me is the editor of HockeyRoyalty.com. He is our Shakespeare. He is our Pulitzer Prize winner, if you will. He is the one. He is the only. He's Mr. Ryan Sykes. What's going on, buddy?
Hey, Scott. It's been a little while since we've gotten together. How are you doing?
I know. We almost forgot what each other's voices sounded like.
I call your voicemail sometimes and then hang up.
Yeah.
just to hear it.
Well, I got to remember to change the message then. Oh, man, that's too much. Like I said, Russ is going to join us in the second half. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring our guest. Our guest is the author of Hockey 365 Daily Stories from the Ice. He's a hockey historian. He's also a contributor for the LA Kings. He is Mr. Mike Commito. Mike, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So how you been? All right?
Yeah, I'm holding up. You know, it's I guess officially the last day of August when we're talking. So I mean, I was saying to my staff this week that it's in our world it's the last week of summer because then next week the new semester starts up. So it was a little I think a little disappointing to phrase it in that way, but I can't complain. Everything's going well up here in Sudbury, so I'm looking forward to the new school year and the new hockey season coming up.
That's right. You're in Sudbury, Ontario.
I am, yeah. 4 hours north of Toronto. So weather is still nice right now, but that's probably going to change in about 6 weeks or so. It's going to start to cool off.
And Mike, when I reached out to you a couple weeks ago to come on the pod, you said you were getting away to the cottage for a bit. Does everyone in Canada have a cottage?
I wish. I don't have a cottage. We were fortunate enough to have friends that have cottages. So we went to we were in Quebec, just on the other side of Ottawa for a few days. Our friends have a place up there, and it was probably the first place I've been to since February of 2020, about a 6-hour drive away, but it felt like to be in another planet because no cell service there. So I was completely off the grid. And it was just really nice to unplug for a few days and get away from Zoom and get away from Teams and all that stuff.
Yeah, sometimes it's nice to unplug. I tell these guys here, I'm going to be on vacation, unplug, and I'm still responding to messages, still writing articles, from my phone.
Oh, yeah. I've done a few staycations this summer, and yeah, unless you're willing to take email off your phone, like people can get a hold of you, they can call you, they can track you down, and even if they don't think they're making you think about work, you're thinking about work, right? So at least you got to go out in the bush and leave your devices behind.
Obviously, a lot of people that follow you on Twitter know that you you post multiple things throughout the day of what happened, on this day. Talk about how you find that and just tell us about you.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I've always loved hockey since I was a kid. I never played at an organized level. My mom likes to joke that we didn't put me in because she thought it was too dangerous, but we did move around a lot when I was a kid. So I think that's partly the reason, maybe the reason my mom said, but I got to play on like backyard rinks and neighborhood rinks and things like that. So I always enjoyed it. And then I always enjoyed the history in general, right? So then I got into the history of hockey, loved collecting hockey cards, loved learning about the stories of the players. Some of my favorite cards that I had as a kid were actually like the hockey cards of the trophies to learn, why the Lady Byng was called the Lady Byng and the history behind that and, the Art Ross and all that stuff. So I think from an early age, I was drawn to history. I eventually got into that, as my academic pursuit. I ended up getting a PhD in Canadian history, but I focused on environmental history. And while I was doing my my graduate work, I started to realize that the skills I was developing, as a historian were transferable to hockey. I'd always, been interested in reading about hockey and reading stories about hockey, but I never pictured myself having a role in that world. But I started to think that, hey, there's plenty of hockey history out there. I think I can maybe use the skills I've been developing, but apply them to tell hockey history for a more popular audience and not necessarily an academic audience like the way that I've been doing. And so really, I just kind of got into it from there. I started just blogging for myself. Eventually some opportunities came up. And as a historian, I found that, among my group of environmental historians, I think we were pretty early adopters of Twitter. I got on Twitter in 2011, maybe just a few years after it launched. And, it was a great platform for historians to connect and share work. But I also noticed there was obviously a burgeoning hockey community there. And I kind of thought that, with my background, hockey history made sense. I admired the work that Jen Conway, aka NHL History Girl, had been doing. I just tried to put my own spin on it. I started doing that, probably, I guess, 6 years ago. And honestly, the way that I initially got into it was that the Hockey Hall of Fame used to have a historic generator where you'd go onto their websites and you would punch in a day and you would hit go, and it would give you it would spit out all the dates, that or all the significant moments that happened on that date. So I started mining that, using that for my Twitter. And then, I kind of got further along, started doing my own research, taking what I could see from NHL.com and other websites and kind of putting that together, pulling stuff out of books I'd read. I'd bookmark stuff, go back, write out, that's a date that I want to remember. And honestly, I think the best resource I had was that the Hockey Hall of Fame had a back-end website that populated that generator. And I was talking to a fellow who runs the St. Louis Blues history Twitter feed. And I think that day I shared with him, a piece of Blues history. And he's like, well, I already know about that. Do you know about this website? So he shared with me this link where if you punch in any day, it'll have a list like this long of everything that happened that day, from birthdays, to any kind of transaction, any big game stuff. It stops at just before the 2004-05 lockout, but it was just a gold mine because you could just change the number, in the address bar of the date, and then it would just keep giving you this information. So I just slowly built, my own archive on Twitter. And so now I think I've built up a pretty good database. So every year I'm just kind of going back through it, rescheduling all those old tweets and then finding new ones as obviously the seasons get updated. But yeah, like that was honestly the biggest thing for me, was being able to have access to that raw data. The funny thing was, though, is that guy, I guess he considers me a competitor. He's since blocked me. So I don't see any of his tweets on, St. Louis Blues history, or he's got another hockey magazine feed. I'm blocked on that too. So him and I started off pretty collegially, but obviously something happened along the way, and I'm no longer privy to those tweets. So it's all good though.
Oh man, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Well, is he verified?
No, I don't know. I mean, maybe he is. I haven't been able to see for a few years. Yeah, I don't know. So, I mean, yeah, maybe I said something, but otherwise, credit to him. He helped me out in a big way. So,
yeah,
for whatever reason, we went astray.
Mike, I know we'll get to it in a little bit, but you are a contributor to the LA Kings in some capacity. But do you have a favorite team?
I mean, I'd be lying if I said anything other than the Maple Leafs. I was born into being a Maple Leafs fan. My mom's a huge Leafs fan. So I think, she's a big hockey fan. And so she ultimately got me into the Leafs. I have memories of watching the playoff runs in the early 90s. So, I was a big Doug Gilmour, Wendell Clark fan growing up. Obviously, we still talk about the missed high stick call in 93. Not that, I think I've come around to accepting what happened, and they had other opportunities to close out that series after that. So it can't all be chalked up to that call. But yeah, that is my favorite team. Obviously, I think with the work that I've done for the Kings over the last 3 years, they obviously have a place in my heart. I think I've, been fortunate enough to be able to cover the team's history in such a way that I'm kind of invested, in the current product on the ice. A lot of my stories don't really focus on what the team is currently doing, but I think I have to, at least in a cursory fashion, keep up with what the team is doing, whether it's moves the front office is making, or, trying to catch as many games as I can. But certainly I think whatever happens, if I end up writing for the Kings for the next, 5 years, or I finish in the next 5 months, I'll always look back, I think, pretty fondly and think about the Kings. There's some local connections here in Sudbury as well with the Kings. And so I think that's always been kind of a reason why I was pretty ecstatic when the opportunity came around in 2018. Obviously, I think the opportunity to contribute to any NHL team is something I would have jumped at 3 years ago, but it just so happens that I think there was a lot of synergies there, between me and the Kings. And I think people of my age growing up with Wayne Gretzky. So obviously it was kind of a no-brainer, for me to jump at that chance when it came around.
Yeah, obviously in 2018, the Kings were going through kind of a transitional period. Just kind of walk us through how the opportunity presented itself.
Yeah, so I mean, I go back and think about the role that Twitter and podcasting played with that. So the full story is that after I finished my PhD, I started emailing every NHL club and asking if they had a team historian on their in their front office, or if they didn't, are they looking for one? And I honestly got responses from quite a few of the teams. I'd say the by and large, the majority of the league had got back to me in some capacity. And so I was on Jesse Cohen's All the King's Men podcast. This was in the summer of 2018. And I reiterated that story about how, I tried to get a gig as a team historian. It never worked out. Talked about, how I'd reached out to all these various clubs. And then I went on Twitter and I repeated that story, just by kind of putting a couple tweets together to kind of tell the story about how I'd tried and failed to become a team historian. And the Kings, I guess, came upon that tweet. And so they replied to me and said, "We never got a message from you," which was not true. I did get a nice response from the Kings at the time, but I was obviously not going to say anything in the moment. So I just said, "No problem. Like, name the time. Happy to connect." And so we took the conversation offline. And, they obviously said that they had been following my work for a little bit with the history stuff that I've been doing for Vice and Sportsnet and other places like that. And we're wondering if I was interested in doing similar type coverage, for the team's website. And so that was in, the summer of 2018. And I wrote my first piece for the team in October of 2018. And, now that at the time that we're talking right now, I've written over 50 stories for the Kings. So honestly, like, it might have come around in its, organically at some point. They might have found me. But I honestly do credit, I think early on too, I forgot this part, because the reason I was on Jesse's podcast is because I used to blog for the Royal Half. This is probably like 5 years ago. And they gave me an opportunity to, I think, kind of find my voice and, figure out what I really wanted to write about. They took a chance to let me kind of write some weird stuff for the website. But, that's, I think, in keeping with what the Royal Half did. And I think some of the levity they brought to the sport. So I think having known some of those folks back in the day, gave me the chance to go on Jesse's podcast when I did. Maybe, the Kings were aware of stuff like that. But I think certainly being on social media and having the opportunities that I had to be on podcasts like Jesse's, I think allowed me, the stars kind of aligned and it all worked out.
Excellent. That's really cool. So tell us about your book. The book is called Hockey 365 Daily Stories from the Ice. So was that more kind of like just the genesis of everything that you had been working on?
Yes, it was pretty much, I think, kind of a culmination of the stuff that I was doing on Twitter, and then the articles I've been writing for places like Vice. So this was the season of 2016-17. I was writing quite regularly for Vice, and I was, full on into the daily, hockey history tweets. And halfway through the year, we were vacationing in Mexico, and kind of, I was sitting on a beach, probably having a few too many cervezas, reading a hockey book. And I thought, like, I've been reading hockey books for as long as I can remember, especially in the last little while when I started writing again. I was just only reading hockey. And I thought, this is the type of book that I like to read. So this is the type of book that I would want to write. And at the time, I was under contract with the University Press to take my PhD work and turn it into a book. I was just never getting started with that. I just didn't have the motivation to do it. I think I'd spent too many years researching the subject and just never thought I would actually get a tangible outcome in my hands. And so on the way home from Mexico, I sketched an outline, kind of taking the stuff that I'd done already for Vice, kind of pairing it with a lot of those tweets I'd been doing. And I had an outline of a daily moment for every day of the year. And the original idea was having these longer essays and then having shorter stories in between. Once we kind of got rolling and I found a publisher, we agreed that I think that approach didn't make sense. And the novelty of 1 page per day per story was really the way to go. And so that's kind of how it took shape. So that was, that first book came out in 2018. So I've got the second book coming out now in just less than a month away. It comes out September 28th. And again, that one's the same format, Hockey 365, but the second period, but 365 brand new stories. I always say 365, but truly it is 366 because you've got to account for those leap years. But from a marketing perspective, Hockey 366, doesn't have the same ring. So.
Well, you got to be careful too, because next time it's going to be the third period, and then you'll be like the overtime, and now the shootout. Shootout round 2, Hockey 360.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely committed to doing the third period just to complete regulation, but you can go into so many different directions with like overtime, sudden death, shootouts, So we'll see, I guess, how this book does, how the third one does, and how long the publisher wants to kind of keep doing this. But there's certainly enough hockey history out there to sustain, several more volumes. That's for sure.
Yeah, Mike, you ever thought about converting some fashion of your book into one of those daily desk calendars where you rip off the the day and it's like the facts or whatever?
Yeah, I actually have, because I think that that's kind of where, probably some of the inspiration for this book came from. Because I think actually in the first book, I talk about in the introduction how, like, I think of it as a word of the day calendar, like in overdrive, because that's essentially the idea here, is that you kind of, when you go to work every day, you flip over the calendar. Although I've always had those, people would give them to me, and then I would go into work, 3 months had passed and you're still kind of like 3 months behind. So like, I truthfully never really kind of got into those, but there's definitely appeal in those. And that's kind of where I thought, if those work and people like those word of the day calendars, then like same kind of approach here with a page a day. You can pick it up and put it down. It's not a read where, everything is linked throughout. Obviously it's all part of hockey history, so they're all part of the same mesh, but you could certainly pick the book up today and then read a few pages and then kind of put it away for a few days, pick it up again. And you're not necessarily having to, remember where you're at, because each page starts a brand new story and they're all pretty much self-contained.
And that's an ideal format, especially for somebody who's got a very short attention span like me. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, people always say it's, it's the perfect bathroom reader, but they kind of shy away when they tell me that, as if that's a bad thing. It's honestly a good thing. I mean, I think when you're trying to come up with a concept of a book, I think your goal is to have people to read it. And so I think if people want to read it in the bathroom, I'm all for that. As long as somebody's, I think I appreciate anybody who's willing to take, their hard-earned money and their time and spend it with my words. So wherever they want to do that is quite all right by me. And I'm more than happy to advocate for having Hockey 365, as a bathroom reader.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I know you already do a podcast, but that actually might be like an interesting podcast idea, to take each of those, stories and make them their own.
Yeah, I agree.
4 or 5 minute story.
Or even like, I'm probably going to get to it, Mike, but, bring a guest in and, accompany the story, encompass it,
Yeah, no, and it's funny you guys say that, because we had actually talked about that when the first book came out, about like doing an audio book, but rather than just doing a typical audio book, maybe there was a way of packaging it as a podcast where you could do those. I could obviously read out a page and do that every day, or release them in chunks. But I think as a podcast, you could, certainly bring on a guest and kind of get into more details about, this story is about you on this day, but obviously your career is much more than a page, and we can kind of talk about it from there. So we didn't end up doing that for the first book. It's certainly something I'm interested in. People have always told me that audiobooks are very difficult. You've got to spend a lot of time, in the studio doing that. I certainly think that, especially for a book of this length, it would be a tall order, but I think a podcast might be a more, manageable format, and maybe just picking and choosing some of the moments from Hockey 365 rather than trying to tackle them all in what would end up being probably, like, I don't even know how many hours it would be, but it would be a pretty long audiobook.
And that's kind of a perfect segue to what I want to talk about next, is your Unlikely Innovators pod. Tell us how that kind of came to be, and just, I guess, what your goal of each episode is.
Yeah, we've so I've obviously been interested in podcasts. I've been fortunate enough that people like you invite me on their podcast. So I've been doing that, for a few years now. I've often thought about starting, my own hockey podcast. I just never found the time. I think I was writing has always been my focus, and so I've always thought of it like, if I started my own podcast, it would probably come at the expense of some of the writing I was doing. So it never was really a good time, to start something new. But it was kind of always in the back of my mind. And then what I realized was that, maybe, hockey is not the way to go for me right now. Because again, I was, with my writing commitments and all the other stuff I wanted to do. I have a colleague that I work with, and a friend of mine, Steve Gravel. We both work at Cambrian College, and we were both, big consumers of podcasts. We've often talked about, could him and I do a podcast just based on some of the, the ramblings we have, with each other in the office. And we're like, well, no one's going to listen to that podcast, but what people might listen to is if it was about work and kind of highlighting, the work that we do in the world of college applied research. And so that was kind of where the idea came. It was this past summer, we thought that maybe that would be a good way to highlight an interesting story, that's happening in the world of college research and in the private sector in terms of R&D and innovation. And so him and I just kind of started doing it where we were focusing on different topics every week, kind of going through the ins and outs of what college applied research is. But we really realized that I think for us to sustain the momentum, we had to start having on guests. And that was really that we were going to eventually get to that point anyway, because we called the show The Unlikely Innovators, because for a number of reasons, I think here in Canada, especially in Ontario, colleges are not seen as places where you would go for innovation or research. It's often the universities that are thought of as the bastions of research. But really, colleges help companies innovate every day. But it's still kind of a best kept secret. And so we wanted to shine a light that colleges are not unlikely, sources of innovation. Steve and myself kind of come from humanities backgrounds, but we work with a lot of companies who are focused on tech adoption. So in our own rights, we're unlikely innovators because we came from history, and now we're working with companies who are trying to, come up with new technologies to deploy underground and mining. And so that's kind of been the theme we've been following with our guests, is we like having on guests who are examples of unlikely innovators or unlikely entrepreneurs, kind of going through their story of, how they came to be where they are. So we've been fortunate enough that, we've been able to continue the podcast. I think that's probably one of the most, challenging things that I'm sure you two can attest to, is just like, once you started, like, how do you maintain it and keep the consistency going? So we've been able to do an episode every week. We put it out. And yeah, I think it's just been a great way for us to hopefully promote the work that we're doing at Cambrian, and also highlight some of those cool stories that are happening, not only in our backyard, but I think, beyond Sudbury and across Canada, and beyond there as well.
Man, that's fantastic. That really is. And, obviously you are so much more than a hockey writer and a historian, obviously, with that podcast. And you're also involved with a foundation, the NEO Kids Foundation, correct?
Yep. Yeah.
Neo tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I got on board with Neo Kids, I guess formally, just this past year, as a member of the board of directors. But I think often, been a supporter of Neo Kids locally here in town. The whole purpose of Neo Kids is obviously just a quick geography lesson here. Sudbury is about 4 hours north of Toronto. And obviously, Toronto has a sick kids hospital, which is, world renowned for its care, for kids and their families as well. But the thing here is, in Northern Ontario, it's difficult for families to obviously make those trips down south to get the care, especially for extended periods of care. It often leaves a kind of family split apart. So the goal of Neo Kids is to help realize that goal of a specialized care facility that's available to families and kids in Northeastern Ontario. So not only Sudbury, but, places like Timmins, North Bay. Obviously, those are Timmins is much farther away from Toronto than we are. It's about a 7 to 8 hour drive. So certainly it's difficult for those families in those parts of the region, to get the care and attention that they need. And so it's obviously been a cause that's been near and dear to my heart. It's cliche to say it, but we had a scare when we were in Toronto, actually, and it just so happened that we were in a hotel that was just a block down from sick kids, and my daughter had an accident in the hotel, and we were able to go there, and the care that we received was honestly second to none, and it just made me feel so thankful to have access to something like that, and in that moment just down the street. But obviously, if we were in Sudbury, it might have been a different story, and so it made me, I think, a little bit more appreciative of places like that, and made me want to give back more locally to help ensure that families who are going through much more, scary things than we did that day, especially over long periods of time, that they deserve to have, the proper care and attention that their kids need and close to home. And so I got involved with them. The interesting thing about Neo Kids is obviously Nick Foligno is a huge supporter of Neo Kids as well. His daughter Milana has obviously had her own struggles growing up. And so I think that he realized that the care that, she's been getting, in the United States is obviously, he sees the need for that in Northeastern Ontario as a good Sudbury boy. And so, he's, I think, the honorary chair of the board. So there's obviously already some hockey connections there. Every year he does this tournament called NHL versus Docs, where some of the doctors from the hospital would play against some NHL players. So Nick would usually bring in some of his teammates from Columbus. Now he'll obviously be, if he does it next year, it'll be maybe some teammates from Boston, probably some former teammates from Columbus. His brother brings, some players as well. And it's a great way for the fans to get some NHL action in August. So you get, you get some exciting games. Obviously we haven't been able to do that because of the pandemic, but I think he wants to do one last send off before closing the chapter on that particular, that fundraiser. But all that to say, I know this has been a really long answer, but when the first book came out, one of the things I wanted to do was try to obviously get the book into as many hands as I could, but also give back. So I did a fundraiser with Neo Kids for Giving Tuesday that year. I donated all of the proceeds from a book sale that I did over a course of 2 weeks and gave that back to Neo Kids. So, so all that to say, it's been a few years since I've been trying to find different ways, to help raise funds, tie it into hockey. But I've been fortunate enough to be able to join the board, over this past year and really get involved in a more, formal and strategic way.
And I mean, your answer was perfect because it kind of resonated with me, and it's partly why we haven't had a podcast episode in, I don't know, what, Scott, 3 weeks?
Yeah, 2-3 weeks.
But last week, my 4-week-old daughter, she was in the pediatric ICU with RSV.
Oh.
But the hospital is 45 minutes from us. I also have twin 3-year-olds, so I'm staying home with them. My wife's at the hospital with their newborn, then she'll come home and I'll go there. So we're like always displaced. So, I mean, you're kind of, what you just said kind of resonated with me, just what I recently kind of went through.
Well, sorry to hear that. Hopefully, how is, is it your 4-week?
It's 4-week-old daughter. Yeah. She's doing much better. Yeah.
She's doing much better. That's good.
Yeah,
that's
thanks.
great to hear.
Yeah. And I can tell you about my full-time job. I'm a firefighter paramedic, and there's nothing scarier than seeing a kid in distress. It's, that's hard. That really is. So, good for you, man, for doing that work, because that's wonderful what you're doing. It
Absolutely,
really is.
Mike.
Thanks.
But so now that the season's going to be getting started back up here again, anyways, and hopefully everything stays normal. Any plans to get to a Kings game, say Toronto, Buffalo, anything like that?
I would love to. Yeah, I'd love to. It was one of those things that we were discussing, before the pandemic happened. I think that was the year where I was going to try to either go down to Toronto to catch them there. The timing didn't work out with work, but my goal was actually to go to LA and watch a game at Staples. So
very cool.
I don't think that's going to happen this year. That's still probably another year away.
Yeah.